Welcome Fort Collins Startup Week. My name is Bill Rigler and I'm a vice president at MAPR agency. And this presentation is all about how founders can generate smart public relations around their funding announcements. For more than 30 years, MAPR has been working with startups just like yours to help them raise visibility for announcements like funding announcements, new products, and everything else that is so necessary to help your business stand out. We know that your time is tight and that you're probably sick of Zoom and then some. And so we've scheduled this presentation to be less than 15 minutes and it's chock full of information. Let's get started. At MAPR, we've helped literally hundreds of companies over the years generate smart public relations. We get approached all the time by founders saying something like, help, we have a funding announcement that's coming out in a few weeks and we don't know how to put everything together. Can you help us? On the other hand, we also get some calls from founders saying, will you please help us? We filed our Form D. We didn't know that we needed to have a press release. We didn't know that we needed to update our website. The story's already gone out. Is it too late for us to leverage this announcement with some public relations? So during the course of this short presentation today, we're going to talk about a few things that every startup needs to know so they can get organized and derive the PR benefits that are going to help you get the visibility that you want. We're honored to be joined today by two really good friends, Nick Greenhalgh of Denver Business Journal and Colorado Inno, and Seth Levine of the Foundry Group. They're both here to help share some insider perspectives and tips that every founder should know, again, before you file your Form D. Now, we've enlisted Seth and Nick to help provide a perspective that you don't often hear, the journalist perspective from the perspective of the people writing the story, and on behalf of the investors, the people who expect PR, but also the right kind of PR. So let's get to our fantastic experts. First up is Nick Greenhalgh of the Denver Business Journal. Nick is the technology reporter for DBJ and the associate editor at Colorado Inno. He writes stories about the incredible people and companies and products that are driving Colorado's startup ecosystem. He also puts together Colorado Inno's daily newsletter, The Beat, which if you haven't signed up for it, please do. It's free and it will be your best resource for all the comings of startup news in Colorado. And he's also one of the nicest tech reporters around. So please join me in welcoming Nick to our panel. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Bill. And thanks to Fort Collins Startup Week. I can't wait to get into this.
So let's get right at it. First of all, you are at the Denver Business Journal. You're at Colorado Inno. You are getting story ideas and pitches a lot. Can you talk to us a little bit about how many pitches do you get in a single day?
Great question. Yeah, you probably don't want to see in my inbox right now. Certainly not inbox 0 or inbox 100 or inbox 1,000. There's a lot in there for sure. I would say I get anywhere between 10 and 15 on average pitches a day, and some days that's 5 and some days that's 30. And these are pitches covering a variety of things, covering funding rounds like we're talking about, product expansions, big hires, all over the place, and everything from across the state.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine. Just, I mean, the publications that you work at are just the biggest names in covering startups, and so you must see some really interesting and maybe some not so interesting pitches come in. When you think about just over your time at Colorado Inno and DBJ, are there any pitches, especially around funding announcements, that have really stood out to you in terms of, like, wow, that was a gold star pitch?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to ignore the ones that have the big splashy numbers at the front, right? When I get something that has the word unicorn in it, obviously it pops right up to the top of my inbox. But I think it's, also important to say that it's not just the big funding announcements that catch my eye. Well-crafted ones are great. And when I say well-crafted, it's ones that answer all the questions I would have if I did a follow-up. It's how much, it's when is this going live? It's what are we using this for? It's all those things. And we can get into that more later. But yeah, it's important for me that a pitch has all the components to show me, like, why should I write about this? I get 10 to 15 a day. What makes this one special versus the other ones? And I can't think of one in particular because I get so many good ones all the time. But to be fair, there's also the flip side where I don't get that.
Well, so let's talk about that, because I think there's actually something really instructive in looking at examples of what not to do to help frame how we should be doing things. Without naming names, are there any kind of stinker pitches that you've received, or anything that you saw in a pitch that you were just silently shaking your head saying, no, that shouldn't be in there?
Well, I'll start by saying I appreciate all the pitches I get. I'll take the diplomatic approach, but um, I'll say that there are definitely things that I see or don't see in pitches that catch my eye, or I wish I did see. And the first thing for me is, location is crucial. So many people from across the country are pitching stories to me, and I only write about Colorado and Denver. So if it doesn't have either Colorado or Denver somewhere in the first three lines, I'm probably not gonna catch it, and I'll move on to the next one. So that's definitely one where I'm like, geez, missed opportunity there. The other thing I would say is, it's important for me that I sort of understand the perspective of this story. And, I understand that a funding announcement is sometimes the biggest thing in the world for the company that's making it. And I totally appreciate that. But I definitely get a little bit jaded when I get the announcement and it's like, game-changing funding announcement for company X, and we're raising $1.5 million. And like, hey, I totally get it. That is game-changing for you, and that is, the most important thing of your day, your month, your year, whatever. I think it's just important for me that I understand that, 1.5 is great, and I'll read about that all day long, but it's not the 250 or 500 or whatever.
So let's pull down on that thread a little bit more, because one of the questions that we often get from founders is, will this publication write about the size of my announcement? Or in other words, is the funding announcement too low or too high? BizWest, a publication that we work with frequently, typically has a threshold of writing about funding announcements on anything over $75,000. Can you talk to us a little bit about what those thresholds at DBJ and Colorado Inno are, just so that we have that perspective as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would say we're in a really great spot with both publications, because we have both of them and they have different focuses. DBJ is here for your larger stories, your Series B and beyond, bigger funding rounds. And then Inno comes in for everything on the early stage. And, early stage for us is true early stage. I write about two people in a garage all the time, or two people in, we work all the time. So for Inno, we'll cover, if the idea is interesting enough, we'll cover as small funding round as you can get. And then, eventually that graduates, and at DBJ we'll go as high as they get to.
Very cool. I just wanted to ask a mechanical question as well. We know that a lot of business journalists rely heavily on Edgar to understand what are some of the announcements that are in the Form D filings that are coming through. Can you talk to us about how you as a journalist use Edgar, and kind of how that informs your approach to some of the stories that you work on?
Yeah. And you mentioned Form D. I'm on Form D, once or twice a day. First thing when I get in the morning, I'm checking on that. Before I leave, I'm checking on that to see if there's anything I missed. And depending on what I find in there, in any regulatory filing, I'll reach out to the company and say, hey, caught this. Don't know if you guys are preparing an announcement or something's coming up, but would love to keep in the loop on that. There are certainly times where I see something and I'm like, they're probably not going to announce this quite yet. This is part of something larger, and I'll file it away and keep it in my notes. But yeah, I'm on there fairly frequently, and definitely get some good story tips off that stuff.
Very good. So last question. If you could tell one thing to the founders at Fort Collins Startup Week watching this today about how to really get some impactful press coverage on their funding announcement, what would that be?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say, don't force it. If you're not ready to announce the funding yet, and there are, things you need to handle on the back end before you're ready, do that. Come to us when you're ready to go, and we'll be ready to go. I've got a checklist of questions to ask, and I'll be ready to answer those or ask those whenever you're ready. So announce when you're ready, and when you're ready to go, we'll be waiting.
Fantastic. Nick, we really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being a part of Fort Collins Startup Week. And for everyone watching, please support local journalism. The work that Nick and his colleagues do is so important to to all of your work. And so we really hope that that not only will you follow them, but also subscribe and do as much as you can. So Nick, thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Now I'm really pleased to introduce my good buddy Seth Levine of the Foundry Group to help give us an investor's perspective on what makes for a really good funding announcement. We've got a lot of questions for Seth about practical information that founders should keep in mind and how to best work with their investors and their advisors. And we're also going to hear a little bit about a new book from Seth as well. So I'm going to ask him about that. All right, Seth, thank you so much for joining us. Let's get right to it. Thanks again for joining us for Fort Collins Startup Week. So first of all, we just got done hearing from Nick Greenhalgh at Denver Business Journal about what, from a journalist perspective, makes for a really good funding announcement. We want to flip the tables a little bit and talk to you as an investor to find out what's really important for you in a funding announcement.
Bill, thanks for having me. And I'll be interested to hear how Nick answered this question. We're recording these sort of asynchronously, so I didn't hear what he said, even though for people watching this, that just happened 30 seconds ago. I guess what I would say is that what the advice that we typically give companies is don't make the funding announcement only about funding. Sometimes I think of funding announcements as it's a little bit like a fourth grade moving up ceremony. It's important to the people who are very close to the company, but not necessarily something that's particularly important unless it's a huge financing or something about it marks a real milestone for a broader audience. And I think the way to make it relevant is to have other things that you talk about. So if you're talking about an important new set of customers or important partnership or a launch into a new market or a new product launch, and your funding, that's typically how we suggest companies think about staging an announcement that includes announcement of funding.
That's awesome. And so let me pull down on that thread just a little bit more, because what I was hearing in that answer was also some process related issues. A lot of the companies and founders that are at Fort Collins Startup Week may not yet be at the level of having a very active investor and advisory board in the same way that you perhaps work with some of your companies. But can you just share some of the lessons that you've learned over the years with what makes for a really good process in terms of interactions between a founder and an investor?
Yeah, and I think a number of the things that I'm going to say, Bill, really, I think are, whether or not you have an investor group that you're working with, I think a lot of these, the things I'm going to talk about sort of make sense for any process, but it starts with planning and planning in advance, right? So what you don't want to do is sort of get to the last minute, realize that either some reporter is going to pick it up the next day, right? And you're scrambling, or that maybe your Form D, which is a regulatory filing that is typically, not always, but typically filed within a couple of weeks of the closing of a transaction. You don't want that to be the forcing function. What you want to do is start well in advance and decide what actually you want to do, and then also how you want to target your announcement. So a lot of times, and this is typically the first question I will actually ask a company when they start talking about really any kind of release of some milestone or a funding announcement, and that is, who's your target audience, right? Sometimes you're looking to hire, and so you want to be targeting an audience of developers or marketing people, whoever it is that you're looking to hire. Other times you still are raising money and you want to target potential investors. Other times you want to do it for vanity purposes and you want to target your mom and dad essentially. And so knowing who it is that you're actually trying to reach is really important, because that will change how you think about approaching potential stories and potential news outlets. And so that's the first thing, right? So it's first and second thing. You start early and you are targeted in terms of what you were trying to get out of the release, and then you craft a release around that, and a release strategy, which might involve, and this is where people like you get involved, but that release strategy might involve things like going out to a specific news outlet or a specific reporter early and seeing if you can get an exclusive story by giving it to them and them alone, right? It might mean that you want a broader set of reporters that are covering it, and you don't do that. So you send it out to a much larger group and ask it to be embargoed for a period of time. And then if you do have investors or mentors or board members around the company that have sort of a platform that is their own, oftentimes, and we at Foundry, we have that, my venture firm. And so oftentimes our companies will coordinate with us a release and targeted outreach to potential news outlets with Foundry or other investors writing about whatever it is that they're releasing on our own blogs or social media platforms to try to kind of have a concerted effort to get the word out there.
I think I love all of that. And I think that some of the companies that we've seen, especially, kind of are challenged by knowing what is that line between the right amount of communication with an investor and too much. And so for much of the activities that you're talking about in terms of that longer term plan, the strategy, engaging platforms and voices in other ways, what have you found is the best way to kind of work with your companies to find an appropriate frequency, I would say, of communications?
Well, and I may be an outlier in this. I actually tell all my companies when I start working with them, you can't send me too many emails. Like, let me deal with the problem of too many emails. Like, don't feel like you should censor your communications to me. And so, and that, generally speaking, I think that's within reason. That's a good rule of thumb for most, certainly companies who are working with investors who are either very large investors or board members. I'm not talking about every investor on your cap table necessarily. So with that as a slight caveat, clear, specific communication is what's important, especially if there's something that the company needs from me or from another investor. Being very clear up front, this is what I'm asking for. Would you review this quote? I'm looking for an intro to these three news outlets, whatever it might be. Like, being very clear and concise about what it is that you want, and then clear about the schedule. Sometimes that can be a little opaque. And I think the more precise and the more clear that communication is, the better.
I love it. And you were mentioning some of your companies earlier, and I know that Foundry Group has had some enormously successful exits with Fitbit and Zynga and others. But can you talk a little bit about how Foundry over the years has invested in Colorado startups and what that Colorado portfolio has looked like for Foundry?
Yeah, historically, something around 25 to 30% of our total dollars have been invested in Colorado. And so I haven't looked it up recently, but we're talking about order of magnitude $500 million that we've put in the ground in Colorado.
Wow.
So it's pretty significant, and some of those companies are companies that many people listening to this have heard of. Certainly, Techstars, we're the largest investor there, and obviously a well-known platform. That's a global platform, but started in Boulder, Colorado, up until the pandemic, was actually across the hall from us and from our offices. But also companies like SendGrid, which went public and then was sold to Twilio. And also companies like Craftsy, the Pros Closet. There's a very long list of companies that are Colorado-based that we're investors in.
I love it. And, sometimes we take for granted, just with both of us being in Boulder and you and I having the chance to connect, but I think we take for granted just what people know and understand about Foundry and who you are. And wondering if maybe you could just give us like a quick 30-second history of kind of how Foundry started and where you're going now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's evolved over time. So I think it's important. I'm glad you asked me that, Bill. So Foundry started in 2006. We were started by myself and three other partners. And we raised in 2007 our first fund. We have a series of early stage funds that we raised up until 2016. And then in 2016, we shifted our focus a little bit, really broadened our focus, and we started investing in other venture funds as well as in companies. And so that was our 2016 fund and our 2018 fund, which invests in other really emerging managers, generally speaking, venture capital firms that have below $100 million sized funds. We have about 35 funds that we've now invested in. And there's probably, 80 companies or so that are in the active portfolio. There's about 120 that have kind of cycled through over the years. And in total, we're not quite at, but we're nearing $3 billion in capital that we have under management.
That's a lot of cheddar. Right on.
That's a lot of cheddar.
So let's switch gears for a second here, because you have a new book coming out. What can you tell us about it, and why did you decide to write it?
How much time do you have? And I would love to talk about it. Thank you for giving me the chance to do that. You can sort of see behind me. It's the book's called The New Builders, and it's really an exploration about the future of business in the United States. And when I say business, I actually don't really at all mean venture funded businesses, because when you think about the continuum of the businesses, fewer than 1% of all companies receive backing from venture capital. And actually only about 17% access bank financing. The large majority of 80% plus don't get financed by either banks or venture capital at all. And what's interesting to understand about the way that entrepreneurship is shaping in the United States is it's becoming increasingly diverse, as is our country. The fastest growing segments of new business owners are women, and specifically women of color. And the book really talks about these large trends in entrepreneurship, and frankly, just the ways that we're not keeping up with our support structures and with our financing structures for those changes. And really, if you think about it, all of our support structures, all of our financing structures were built for yesterday's entrepreneurs, white, male, oftentimes starting a high growth business on one of the coasts. That's just not the nature of businesses that are being started right now. And the result of not being supportive of these businesses is that actually entrepreneurship in the United States is waning in ways that are incredibly alarming when you actually look at the data, and surprising, because when I talked to my friends about the data that we found, most people just didn't believe it, didn't realize that entrepreneurship writ large was in so much peril. We did all this research for the book.
What does that look like, Seth?
Well, it looks like any business that you might see as you walk down Main Street, for example. And the book is really structured as a series of vignettes. We actually meet, we call these new group of founders new builders. And we meet a series of new builders throughout the book. So really each chapter is about one or two new builders. We tell their story, and then we put their story in the context of a larger trend that's taking place in entrepreneurship, whether that's how to access bank financing, or whether that's the changing nature of the relationship between businesses and their communities. And these are the sort of the stories that we tell in the new builders. I should add that when we spent a couple, my co-author and I, Elizabeth McBride, she and I spent the last 2 years working, researching on the book, doing our interviews. And then right as we went to start writing it up, COVID hit, and it really accelerated all of the trends that we started to see. And I think makes what we describe in the book, which is the urgent need to change these systems of support and finance, that much more critical to understand. So the book's going to be out on May 4th. If you go to thenewbuilders.com, you can get some more information on how to pre-order it, and a little bit more color on some of the people that we talk about. There's lots of pictures on the website of some of the new builders that we profile in the book, et cetera.
Fantastic. And Elizabeth McBride at MIT and the Entrepreneurship Center there. I mean, just what an incredible co-author. I really want to explore a little bit more about what you learned, especially with the impact of COVID, because obviously, that's such an accelerant in issues of racial inequities, economic inequities, and so much more. Did you have a case study that gave you hope, or that could point to what a future could look like for us?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I think all of our case studies gave us hope. As we finished writing the book, we went and checked in with all of the new builders, and their new builders in general are incredibly gritty, and frankly, incredibly optimistic as a group. And we were, I think, pleasantly surprised to find that each of the people that we had talked with was making it work in one way or another. Now, not everyone stayed open as a business. We had a couple that remained open but took side jobs. There's the first chocolatier in Arkansas is a woman that we profiled, really interesting Black woman who has had several incarnations of her business. She's still running her business, Cocoa Bella Chocolates, but she's an accountant as well, so she's also doing some side work. But that speaks to both her passion about her work as well as her grittiness, that she's making a go of it. And of course, one of the main new builders that we profile is a woman, Danaris Mazzara, who's in Lawrence, Massachusetts, who quite literally started her business with $37 of food stamps. And built that into first a business where she was selling flan to her coworkers at the factory where she worked. Eventually was able to get enough money and support from some community members in Lawrence to build a bakery. And she now has this main street bakery in downtown Lawrence, Massachusetts. And she's managed to stay open and actually keep all of her employees employed, perhaps, maybe too much. I mean, she's actually had to dip significantly into her personal savings, but it's a real story of grit and hope, and it's pretty amazing to realize sort of what you can do with very little. And I think really, if there's any lesson from the book, it's that a little bit of support goes a long way, and of course financial support is really important, but in some respects it's the other types of support, the mentorship, the business knowledge, the know-how, and just frankly, a little bit of just, someone to talk to when things get challenging or when you're down. In some respects, those are even more important. And as we talk about a bunch of different unique and novel financing solutions that different communities have brought into their markets. But the one thing that all of them have in common is that they all pair financing with some form of help and mentorship. And I think that's something for us to think about as we think about, for example, in Colorado, how do we help broaden the umbrella that is supported by organizations that are working in entrepreneurship to include those businesses that are in Main Street or in an office park, is how do we bring together more support services and mentorship for them?
How amazing. I can't wait to read it. And for those of you watching, you can both pre-order the book on the book's website and also go to sethlevine.com for more information, as well as to hit his must-read blog. So Seth, I really want to thank you for your time. We really, really appreciate your insights, and can't wait to see you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Bill. I appreciate you having me.
Thanks very much again to Nick and Seth for joining us today. So let's just do a quick recap of what we've heard. First of all, is line up all of your facts. Do you know the amount, who the main investors are, how that money is going to be used, any other pertinent details? The more specific you can get, the better the likelihood that you're going to have a really, really good story. Secondly, is do your homework. Make sure that you're reaching out to the right person and the right outlet. The likelihood of getting a story in the New York Times is pretty low, but are there local publications that would run your story and can actually drive sales and business? Lastly, make sure that you're connecting with your stakeholders well in advance. As Seth said, bring your investors in early, find out how you can leverage their networks, and let's make sure again that everybody is signed off on any communications before they go out. We've included these and a bunch of other really helpful tips online at mapr.agency/startupfoco, where we've got a bunch of links to helpful resources, blog posts, as well as other videos, including information to Seth Levine's new book, which is thenewbuilders.com, again, as well as some awesome tutorials on how to pitch like a pro. So thanks very much for all of your time, and we really look forward to seeing you guys soon.